But there's another and perhaps far stronger imperative for going global, and a far more important reason why global is the point of reference for people who wish to consider responsible higher education institutions. Many of today's challenges, threats, and challenges are global in nature. The Millennium Development Goals point to our global responsibilities in terms of poverty and hunger eradication, provision of universal education, maternal health, and meeting other basic needs. Last week's UN Summit on MDGs still notes the vast distance that we need to travel to meet these goals, and clearly compel higher education as well to address in their specific manner issues of climate change, sustainable agriculture, protection of biodiversity, and many others. These challenges should facilitate going global in terms of social responsibility and offer a solid terrain on which to build a global higher education landscape. So to end this general scan of the major issues, trends, and challenges facing higher education at every possible level, let me just underline that the expectations placed on higher education are continuously expanding. And at the same time, the needed investments are not being made. And in fact, in many parts of the world, there are fairly major cuts being made as various stimulus packages are coming to an end, and as the effort to invest out of the economic crisis is also coming to an end. This adds to the already complex system that characterizes the times we live in and renders the choices higher education institutions need to make all the more difficult. Clearly, this complexity also argues for partnerships, collaborations, learning from each other, sharing innovations and good practices. So there isn't a single system that has all the answers, nor a single model that can be applied in all the different contexts. I started my presentation by a question, which was whether internationalization, globalization, and regionalization in higher education are one and the same trend. This was a ploy to get you interested in the presentation, since I certainly do not have a single answer, but I do have an opinion. I think as globalization permeates every aspect of our life, economic, cultural, political, it brings with it more competition, more interdependence, and pushes our boundaries outward all the time. Regional integration and regionalization certainly are an important strategy to strengthen participating countries' clout, if you will, in the global contest, whether in economic terms or in higher education terms. One could argue that regional integration is both a more geographically limited version of globalization and a stepping stone towards more globalization. In higher education, some of the regional strategies being developed actually articulate this global positioning as their fundamental goal. In Europe, for example, the Lisbon strategy, adopted in year 2000, was designed or aimed at making European Union the most competitive economy in the world by focusing on research and development and transitioning into the knowledge economy. It was to make Europe more attractive and stop the exodus or brain drain of highly qualified people and research investments, which were moving elsewhere, most particularly to the US. The Bologna process, which was launched 1 year earlier, is in a way the higher education leg of this regional strategy, though it was not launched by the European Union, but rather by the ministers of higher education. But it also aims to reform higher education in Europe to make it more attractive and better performing, again, in comparison and often in competition with others, the US most particularly. Thus, regionalism has emerged as a powerful force within globalization, as it permits organizations to collaborate to maximum benefits. But regionalization is also going global. Indeed, even the most advanced and comprehensive regional effort, such as the Bologna process, is pressured from within and by other regions to be more active at the wider global, in the higher education global space. The Bologna process now has a working group mandated to develop its global dimension. The ministers that meet every 2 years now hold a global forum to which ministers from beyond the region are being invited. Bologna has also introduced many structuring instruments that are being adopted elsewhere, including the credit transfer systems, the qualification framework, and now the most recent one, the U-Multi-Rank, which is a European Union-funded feasibility project to create a new global, multidimensional university ranking system. So these structuring instruments may have a long-term impact, a deep long-term impact on higher education everywhere else. Now, let me turn to internationalization of higher education for a few minutes, the last part of my presentation, so that I can share with you some of the findings of the IAU Third Global Survey on internationalization. First of all, this process is also changing and needs to be continuously monitored and discussed. Just like globalization, it has both negative and positive impacts. Similarly, with globalization, it can have winners and losers unless the risks are understood and addressed. For IAU, internationalization of higher education is a top priority in line with our mandate and our mission. The process that IAU promotes in its policies and services is first of all a process that aims to change the academic dimensions of the sector. We take Dr. Jane Knight's definition and see internationalization, which is expected as a process that is expected to introduce new international and intercultural dimensions into teaching, learning, as well as research functions. It opens up higher education sector to the world, bringing different languages and ways to view the world into the curriculum. It allows a new, more outward-oriented research questions to be addressed and pays attention to the local but also to the global agenda, developing partnerships for reasons of solidarity and mutuality of learning. It includes research cooperation and joint projects, academic mobility for students and faculty, and covers changes in curriculum, even co-development of curriculum in programs such as joint or dual degree programs. Yet IAU also recognizes that internationalization processes may lead institutions to take on globalizing strategies, acting as an industry that needs to remain competitive, reach new clients, innovate its products and services, capture market share, improve its reputation, and make its brand recognizable. Examples of these strategies are far more spectacular and may appear more attractive to some. They are, however, far more controversial, risky, and for some, they have little to do with academic pursuits of more globally prepared and oriented graduates. Finally, there's no neat line separating these two approaches, and most universities are forced or are adopting a mixture of all kinds. However, no matter what approach to internationalization is being adopted, the fact is that this process is being taken seriously by ever-increasing number of institutions, and most particularly by leaders of higher education institutions. For that reason, internationalization is impacting on every level of the university, and I could have mentioned it in my earlier part as I talked about students, programs, institutional reforms. If we look at this slide, we can see that the vast majority of institutions have found that over the past 3 years, internationalization as a policy has increased in importance. Only 1% of our responses, and our responses covered 115 countries and more than 700 institutions, only 1% responded to say that this area of institutional policymaking decreased in importance. If we look at why institutions are undertaking internationalization and look at the rationales, here are the top 3. I hope you can see the chart. The first column is the result at the aggregate level. And you can see that at the global level, to improve student preparedness for a more globalized world is the top rationale for internationalization, and it is followed by the internationalization of curriculum. Third, at the global level, is to enhance the international profile of an institution. But if you look at the results at the regional level, you can see a fairly major diversity, with Africa, for example, placing research collaboration at the top of its list of rationales, the Middle East doing the same. So the slide shows quite clearly that the rationales for going international can vary quite a lot. In Latin America and the Caribbean, improving student preparedness is the number 1 rationale, as is internationalization curriculum the second. But research production is there as well. If we look at the 5 most important activities and how resources are spent in institutions in terms of internationalization, you can see they're in line with the rationale, because the top 5 include opportunities for students to go abroad, international student exchanges and attracting international students, strengthening curriculum, and providing opportunities for faculty. The second most important activity is related to the research rationale, and international research collaboration are also receiving attention and resources. As I said, there are both winners and losers in internationalization, so if we look at what institutions perceive as the risks of internationalization, again, the first column identifies the results at the aggregate level. And you can see that commodification of education programs, the brain drain, and the increase in number of foreign degree mills are the top 3 risks. What this chart doesn't show, but it was also one of the findings, institutions in Europe and North America, their answer, the highest answer, was no risks at all. So it is clear that for some institutions the risks are less apparent than others, whereas for institutions in the developing part of the world, the risks are quite clear, and brain drain is the top risk in Africa and in Latin America, followed by the increase in degree mills and the commodification or commercialization of programs. When we looked at what stands in the way of increased internationalization, we were able to compare the answers from our survey undertaken in 2005. I think what is clear is that the economic crisis has been has passed through or is with us, because both internal and external obstacle number one is funding and the limited access to funding available for internationalization. The second and third obstacles are also interesting, I think. Limited faculty interest and involvement has been found as a second level internal obstacle, and difficulties in recognition and equivalences is an external obstacle of the second order. The language barrier is there, and if you look at in 2005, the financial obstacle was not mentioned at all, but I think the others are similar and persistent. Finally, if we look at the geographic priorities that internationalization strategies are taking on, I think what is very, very important in this slide is that intra-regional collaboration is seen as the most important in at least 3 of the world's region. Africa, Asia-Pacific, and Europe all feel that intra-regional cooperation is more important than any other. Also important to note is that Latin America, the Middle East, and were not chosen as the top priority by any other region but their own. Africa was chosen by its own, but by no one else. So these 3 regions are not on the radar screen, or at least not at the top of the priority list of geographic priorities for internationalization. So what can we conclude from these rather lengthy remarks? I think we've heard it all morning as well. Higher education is of central importance and undergoing rapid and continuous change everywhere. The context dictates specific strategies, but I think we can certainly say that most often these strategies seek to balance between a focus on quality education, responding to expanding numbers of students, and research excellence. And I think that societal choices dictate whether we place more importance on competitiveness, social cohesion. I don't think that we are seeing the paradigmatic shift that one of our colleagues mentioned this morning, where we have moved towards a social cohesion agenda in higher education. I believe we're still very much in the competitiveness agenda in higher education. But I also don't think that these are an either-or strategies. I think we need to push for both. It's a question of trying to find ways to combine the two. The frame of reference for higher education decision-making has shifted. There we do see a shift, and I would argue that it has been shifting for quite some time from the local national frame of reference to the regional, and in some cases to the international and global. And I would also argue that the distinctions between what is local and national and what is international or regional are blurring. Finally, I think some of the regional efforts in higher education integration can serve to structure developments more broadly. An example of the Bologna process, this is a negotiated, multi-stakeholder process where students, faculty members, institutional leaders do work with the ministers to create the instruments. Those approaches, if not the instruments, can be adopted elsewhere and can structure what happens in higher education, even globally. In terms of internationalization, I think the conclusions I would draw from our study are that it is a central policy. It's become a central policy area, not a marginal area in most institutions. It's no longer an option. Regional differences do exist in terms of rationales, risks, obstacles encountered, and we need to take very good care to take these into consideration. Students are a main focus everywhere, but in Middle East and Africa, where the particular context dictates the need to strengthen research capacity and knowledge production through international cooperation. As I said, there is far less risk perceived by institutions in industrialized countries, whereas the risk in developing countries is real and is perceived as real, and it is mostly brain drain, as it was 4 years ago. And finally, funding as a main obstacle, the lack of human capacity for internationalization and expertise are seen as major obstacles. I think that we need to really understand the intra-regional geographic focus and its strength, but not forget that the world is made up of 6 regions, at least in our case, and we must make sure that we work with all of them. Europe remains the overall most popular region in the world, but in Europe, the fact that there is a strong link between prestige and internationalization poses perhaps some risks about how Europe cooperates worldwide. The question I would ask is, can internationalization, curriculum, mobility, partnerships, be inclusive and truly global? Can it help higher education address the global agenda and prepare students for tomorrow? In a way, that is what internationalization should be able to do. So we need to build a truly global landscape through cooperation and partnerships with institutions from around the world and build inclusive internationalization. We need to find funds, including from industry. We need to prepare and mobilize faculty members and staff of our institutions and resolve some of those persistent obstacles, which are about credit and credential recognition. And we need to build strategies of internationalization that respect diversity and the needs and interests specific to our partners. For IAU, what are we going to do? The first thing that I can say will be a major effort on our part. We will disseminate the global survey report, which has just been published on Friday. The printer just gave it to us on Friday. We will organize in April a meeting of associations from around the world to look at the strategies of internationalization under the theme of new actors and new approaches. This will be held in New Delhi in India. We are developing a service to assist institutions in developing their own internationalization strategies, being very keen to improve equitable access to higher education. We have a project, a comparative project, looking at 2 regions of the world, the Americas and Asia, in how they address equity and access in higher education. And our next international conference will have this as the theme and will take place in Kenyatta University. And finally, still keeping with our commitment to the global agenda and global responsibility, our general conference in 2012 has the theme higher education and the global agenda. Thank you very much for listening, and if you want more information about the association or to contact me, please don't hesitate. Thank you.